Good afternoon. It's 2 o'clock and here we are. We're back with Florida Supernature. It's me, James Stevenson, with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, Pinellas County Extension. We've got something different for you this time. Instead of a beginning to end PowerPoint presentation, we've gone out in the field and we've collected some data and some footage to kind of introduce to you some of the various wetland habitats that we have here in Pinellas County. Today's presentation, At Home in a Cypress Dome. And if you're not sure what a Cypress Dome is, that'll be one of our objectives today, to introduce you to this interesting kind of miniature landscape, a miniature wetland. If you're not familiar, the UF-IFAS extension is an extension of the University of Florida. Each county has an extension office where we have faculty that perform outreach. We call it extension, that form of outreach, in a variety of subject areas. Probably best known for our landscape advice, but we're also I have faculty here where I'm coming to you from the Brooker Creek Preserve Environmental Education Center. The faculty here provides research-based information on issues that surround the environment, the natural areas, wild places, preserves, water quality, everything outdoors, everything about the natural world coming to you here from the Brooker Creek Preserve, 9,000 acres of undeveloped Pinellas County, which is kind of unheard of. So this is me coming to you live. I'll be dipping in and out of today's presentation. Interspersing today's presentation will be short video clips. The chat is enabled for today's presentation. So myself and Julia will be keeping our eye on the chat box. You can feel free to enter your comments, questions, complaints, all these kinds of things, and we'll try and get to that throughout. And if we don't manage to get to questions and comments throughout today's presentation, we'll certainly visit them at the end. So let's see how this goes. It's a new format for us, so fingers crossed on this Florida Supernature 2.0. Now that it's September, if you can believe it. Here we are. Here we go.
Welcome back to Florida Supernature. I'm James Stevenson with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences here in Pinellas County, coming to you from Brooker Creek Preserve. This month, we're going to focus on Brooker Creek's wetlands. We're going to explore a Cypress Dome, a very special small wetland. We'll look at man-made wetlands, channels that cut through the preserve that channel the water where humans want it to go. We'll look at a pond ecosystem, and we'll finish up in the flooded forest. All different wetlands in one preserve. So we hope you enjoy our series, Florida Supernature, as we explore the wetlands here in Pinellas County.
So wetlands basically are defined as several different landscape types. We have wetlands that are swamps, wetlands that are marshes, lakes, ponds, and rivers. And these shouldn't be unfamiliar terms, but as scientists, as of today, we'll look at these different types of wetlands and what gives them their particular names. The wetlands are defined by a couple of different things, and we'll mention this several times throughout today's presentation. A wetland has to have a hydric soil, which is the fancy scientific way of saying that the soil is mud, a saturated organic soil. Also, specific indicator species of plants and animals. To be defined as a wetland, certain species have to be located within the bounds of that wetland. So wildlife species and vegetation species. And here we have a slide of two what would be called indicator species of a wetland. Both of these, this plant and this animal, are dependent on a wetland to even exist. So we have a frog. Of course, we know that frogs are dependent on freshwater systems, and proper duckweed, a floating, flowering plant that simply cannot exist in an upland situation rather than what's referred to as a wetland situation. Wetlands include swamps. Now, what defines a swamp is an area of land that has the hydric soil and the indicator species and is dominated by trees. That's what we call a swamp. We'll refer to that as a flooded forest later on in a couple of weeks' time. A marsh is an area of hydric soils with indicator species of plants and animals, but the dominant plants are not trees. In this marsh, you can see the dominant plant is really grass. So grass, of course, is not a tree. And the trees are monocots in this case, which are palm trees. So technically not trees, but we'll get into that in another lecture. A marsh is a flooded area where the dominant vegetation is not trees, something other than trees. Our local lake is defined as a still body of water that meets some sort of size minimum or maximum to be defined as a lake. I don't have those numbers. It's not really my kind of thing, but suffice it to say that a lake is bigger than a pond, whereas a pond, although they do exist, sometimes they are the remnants of a slow-moving river that might have broken off and now exist as a still body of water. Sometimes ponds can be spring-fed. So these are small, still or very slowly moving bodies of water, basically that you can see or even shout from one side to the other. And of course, rivers. And our local river would be the Hillsborough River, cutting through our neighbor county over in Hillsborough County. So those are wetlands, basically. And we'll go over this at the beginning of each of our wetland lectures just to kind of drive these home. Wetlands are incredibly important from a conservation point of view because they support so much biodiversity. They're so incredibly important, and wetlands represent pieces of larger circumscriptions of land, which are often referred to as watersheds, areas where not only the benefit the native wildlife and the native plants and native animals and so on, but they also help protect, filter, clean, and provide some, if not all, of our drinking water in certain areas. So that's why, of course, wetlands are important. So let's take a look at one of these little wetlands called the Cypress Dome. And what makes a Cypress Dome? Here's a graphic. You can Google Cypress Dome. You can get this kind of thing. But let me just grab a highlighter here. There's the laser pointer, and we're in. The graphic over here on the left represents the height. This would be 3 feet, 2 feet, 1 feet, sea level we'll call that, and then below. So we have an elevation and a higher elevation above what we'll call sea level, and we have drier soils here in Florida. Of course, we have sand and dry soil, so we have plant communities associated with that water level, which are referred to as mesic, which means dry-ish. And then a little bit going further down towards water level, and we end up in hydric conditions. Mesic being dry, hydric, you can hear hydro, meaning a little bit wetter. Further downhill, you start to get indicator species that are associated with whatever a marl prairie is. There's a whole language that's associated with landscape types, but you can see the changes as you move downhill, those indicator species that depend on various water levels. And then we get into our cypress, which are perfectly adapted to a much wetter soil. Further down into the marshy areas where we talked about there were knot trees, and then the center of this cypress dome. So you can see it's the elevation, the amount of available soil moisture that invites these species that can tolerate those various levels of moisture. What can cause the actual dome is often a sinkhole. And sinkhole is probably not an unfamiliar term. We've all heard of the sinkholes and the problems that they can cause. Well, what causes many sinkholes is a degradation of this limestone. We have a limestone floor in many parts of Florida. And limestone, you might be aware, calcareous, it's made of the calcium shells of ancient sea life. That calcium can be eroded away by acids. The limestone is very basic, and the acid can actually erode that limestone. And that's what you have. You have acidic, organic layer that might be leaking down into the limestone. As it continues to eat away, the ground above can eventually give way and form that sinkhole. These can happen slowly, or of course they can happen very quickly. The resulting hole then fills up with water, and species that can tolerate that standing water as these areas fill up tend to move in and take advantage of those water levels that they're pre-adapted for. And that's what brings us to the Cypress Dome itself. Grabbing the arrow. And now we'll see how a Cypress Dome gets its name. Can see taller trees towards the center and shorter trees towards the edge. It's a dome, and this is a three-dimensional, obviously. So a circular sinkhole, taller trees towards the center, creating that dome-like effect. You can see the scale. I'm kind of average height, 5'9". You can see the varying water levels on the trees as the sinkholes fill and empty depending on rain, runoff, that sort of thing, evaporation. Through the tops of the trees, right here in the center of the dome, looking towards the center of the dome. And moving on, we'll get way up above and have a look at what the Cypress Dome looks like in context of an agricultural field, a pasture. Clearly defining that dome shape. And in the background, you can see the rest of the preserve stretching off towards the horizon. So, of course, not pasture land in the preserve. So these domes just appear here and there, dotted throughout the otherwise forest. So what are we going to find in the Cypress Dome? Let's find out.
So with just a slight change in elevation, we're going to move from this pine and oak upland slowly, gradually downhill into a very small wetland known as the Cypress Dome. So here we are at the edge of the Cypress Dome. And a wetland is defined by three things. You think you would understand what a wetland is just because of the presence of water. But to be really considered a wetland, three factors have to be met. Proper soil, indicator species, including plants and animals. So it's not hard to determine what kind of soil we have here. Just getting a handful, this rich, organic bits of leaves and twigs, slowly decomposing in the absence of oxygen. Wetlands, standing water, are usually very poor in dissolved oxygen, so decomposition takes much longer. The plants are adapted to that, and as the soils build up, the plants take advantage of that. To compensate for the lack of oxygen, certain species, like the cypress, produce breathing apparatus that we'll look at in a little bit. So being in a cypress dome, of course, we're going to find cypress trees. And here we have a pond cypress. And given their name, pond cypress, they tend to prefer slowly moving or even still water. We're in a proper cypress dome here, so this is a circular depression with the smaller trees towards the outside and the taller trees towards the middle. Cypress are conifers. They're deciduous conifers. We usually think about conifers as the pines and the firs and the spruce, the evergreens. But this conifer loses its leaves, its needles, in the autumn every year. And so more sunlight can penetrate the cypress dome in the wintertime. That means that the plants that grow inside the dome have to adapt to those changing light levels. The cypress trees themselves have some really good adaptations to living in standing water. They have these buttressed bases. The base of their trunk is swollen. You'll remember that a larger surface area is going to make you more stable, especially in an unsteady soil like mud. So the buttressing on the base of the cypress helps keep that balance. The cypress dome, the water levels are seasonal, and you can see marks on the cypress trees where the water has been at its highest and all the way down to its lowest. Now, species like this lichen, they can tolerate a certain amount of inundation. You see where this species is growing from here to here, but below that, where the water level remains for a lot of the rainy season, which of course we're coming to the end of now, this species of lichen cannot tolerate that amount of inundation. So you don't find this species well represented beneath that water line or that water mark. Other species like the swamp fern, which we have here, they're adapted to those seasonal fluctuations in water levels. So in the summer, they're actually standing here with their feet wet. Their roots are in that anaerobic, that oxygen poor environment. But during the winter, these evergreen ferns are going to be on dry land. These ferns are undergoing their reproductive phase right now. We've seen this before with the swamp fern. The underside of the frond producing those spore-bearing structures underneath. Those spores will be released. They'll drift off onto some dry land, germinate and grow, hopefully into another generation of fern. So this is one of the species that's adapted to life on dry and submerged soils. Let's head further into the dome and see what we can find. I think we need to put on waders and go. One of the hunting spiders. Now these spiders can produce silk, but they don't produce webs. They don't catch their prey in a web. They actually hunt them down, giving them the name. Included in this group are the aptly named huntsman spiders and the wolf spiders, many different common names for this group. But let me just slowly and secretly slip my finger closer to this animal, just for a matter of scale. It's a large predator, very fast moving, but as you can see, it's also camouflaged during the day, so it can lie in wait, waiting for prey, or it can also avoid detection by potential predators.
So the question is, are you crazy putting your finger up next to a spider like that? Yes, it's a large spider. It's a hunting spider. Spiders, of course, do have fangs and they immobilize their prey and all that sort of thing, but way, way, way too big to be prey. And I was very careful not to threaten this animal anyway that would have caused it to defend itself. If it had reacted to our presence, to my presence, of course, I would have backed away. So again, don't try this at home. We kind of know what we're doing.
One of the hunting...
Yeah, we heard you before. Here we go.
All right, we're going to head in to the small Cypress Dome and take a look at some of the wetland species that live here. Now, as we enter the dome, we're going to have to be very careful of some tripping hazards. And here's one of those knees, one of the Pneumatophores, they're called. These are produced by the cypress trees, and they poke up over the surface of the water so that they can exchange oxygen to the roots. Now, roots also need oxygen, and you can see when I disturb this little island of survival, there's a colony of ants that have kind of escaped the water and found this high ground on this small cypress knee. The color of the water? The color of the water produced by tannins, and tannins is basically the fancy word for tea, T-E-A, just like the tea that you drink is made from the leaves of a camellia bush. The tea that makes the water in a standing wetland is produced by the pigments or the tannins, the chemicals, the acids in the decomposing leaves, and that's what gives swamp water its characteristic orange color. Now let's watch our step as we travel through this Cypress Dome, avoiding those very knees. Other species that find their home in seasonally flooded forests, and in particular this small wetland known as the Cypress Dome. This is the Dehoon Holly. It's one of our native hollies. It's just beginning to ripen its fruit, which will coincide with the arrival of our migratory songbirds that will use the fuel found in these fruits to help feed them and propel them on as they journey southward for the winter. So this is the Dehoon Holly, again a species that's perfectly suited to life both on dry and seasonally submerged soils. Going a little bit further in. Now the hollies are evergreen. The holly trees that we just visited, the hollies are evergreen. So that's going to cast some shade into this area of the dome. And you can see there's really not much emergent vegetation. There's not many of those ferns that we met earlier that are adapted to that dry and wet cycle. That suggests that this part of the dome is continually flooded throughout the year. You can see that it's particularly deep. It comes up to my knee, and the knee of the cypress is emerging above that water level. And you can see this rust color, that indicates that this knee is continuing to grow. So cypress knees can get to be about a meter and a half tall. In certain swamps they can be much larger, but they kind of get to the height that they need to be given the fluctuating water levels of a particular dome in a particular place. But speaking of islands of survival, just behind me here, the base of these trees has allowed some of that organic soil to collect and build, and the leaves that fall haven't fallen into water. They've fallen onto dry land and produced more of an upland soil. So it's given species like that fern that can't survive 1 foot further on, just enough of that seasonal inundation and dry land to continue to grow. Other species can find their ways onto these small islands, but of course they will have to compete with the other trees, shrubs, evergreens, and deciduous plants that are found in this wetland. Here we are in the heart of this small cypress dome, and that's where you're going to find the tallest, healthiest trees. This is one of the largest cypress within this particular dome. It's not necessarily the oldest. These cypress might have even all germinated around the same time as they colonized this area, which was formerly upland, but after whatever circumstance led to the creation of this dome, these trees were able to germinate and outcompete the other species that were growing nearby. This tree represents the largest, but again, like I said, not necessarily the oldest. It has the best access to water, and water can be a limiting factor when you're talking about an ecosystem. So the trees in the center of the dome have the most water year-round, so they're going to be able to take advantage of that water level year-round. The plants on the edge of the dome, you'll recall, the water levels fluctuate. So sometimes of the year they're in dry ground, so they're just simply not going to get as big. So it's not a case of the older cypress being in the center and their offspring being around the edge. It has to do more with the amount of nutrient and, more importantly, the amount of water. Another tree species in the Cypress Dome is the Tupelo. You might be familiar with Tupelo honey. This is Nyssa. The genus is Nyssa. And it too has adaptations to living in seasonally flooded areas, or in this case, perennially flooded areas, the Cypress Dome. And like the cypress, this tree has a widened trunk base that helps stabilize it in this unsteady soil. Now, the same species is adapted to living in more upland conditions outside of a swamp, but this seedling was able to get established, and it was able to compete with the cypress, and it's got its place in the sun. So this is about about a 100-year-old tree right here. The same species growing in an upland situation would not have this buttressed trunk base. This is a physical adaptation to the presence or the existence of this muddy soil. So plants can actually feel their environment and adapt to that. Life and death in a cypress dome. Here we have what looks like a former holly. This plant might have reached its lifespan. It might have reached the age that it was simply going to get. It might have fallen victim to some disease. It doesn't appear to have been struck by lightning, but all kinds of things can happen to species in the wild. But as this dead tree stands here, it's filling up with all sorts of organisms, fungus, beetles, other insects, all kind of grubs and worms and all kind of wonderful things that provide nutrient to other forms of wildlife. So this dead tree is certainly supporting lots and lots of other hungry mouths that need feeding. Here's a good example of that water level, the water line, and actually right next to you there's a perfect example of that delineation between high water, and you can see if this were to get even closer that species of lichen just could not survive inundation for that long. I think that.
All right, I cannot answer questions. I can't type answers to questions. I've just realized if I try and do that, it pauses the video, but we have a couple of things. I had a question about the aerials of that cypress dome, if that was taken by a drone. It was taken by a very, very long selfie stick. No, we have a partner with the City of Tarpon Springs. The arborist at Tarpon Springs provided that footage for us. We had to get special permission, of course. Drones aren't something, they're not toys. So yes, we did actually use a drone to capture that. Looks like fun. It certainly was and is fun. Must say that, of course, the standing water of a cypress dome is, of course, the perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes. And so consider this a guided hike that you didn't have to be a part of. You can just let us do the hiking and y'all can do the following. What happens if the spider had bit me? Thankfully, didn't experiment to see what would happen there. All spiders have, well, okay, let's never say all, but spiders as a group tend to have fangs, and those fangs are more often than not equipped with some sort of venom that is either used to paralyze or digest, or paralyze and digest their prey species. Sometimes that venom can affect us as well. So some of the larger spiders, if they are able to get purchase and defend themselves, if you try and catch or kill them, they can use those fangs as defense. And if that particular spider had gotten a fang into me, it might have felt like another sort of annoying, like an insect bite or something like that. Let's scroll up and see what other kind of questions we have kind of midway through the presentation. No gators, we'll talk about that in just a bit. Would it be safe to walk as long as you're in waders? Alligator dangers, right. So we do have several known young alligators here at the preserve that were hatched in the past couple of months. As professionals, we visit sites regularly, and on the day of our recording, we make sure to check the perimeters, check the areas, make sure that we're not going to disturb any wildlife. The backside, our first mission is to make sure that we're not going to disturb any wildlife. Behind that, we put our personal safety in the forefront and make sure that we're not putting ourselves in any dangers. Of course, it is a wetland. There are snakes, there are alligators and things like that, but through experience and through training, we know how to keep our eye out for it. Do cypress knees emerge from the roots? Are they a part of the root? Yes, they are. The cypress knees, which we talked about before, you can see in the background of the slide here that it's actually called butt swell. The base of the cypress tree is swollen and the roots kind of fan out through the saturated soil. Being conifers, they do have a initial taproot that goes down and anchors the plant, but those lateral roots can come back up out of the whatever ground they're growing on, be it soil or in the case of standing water, up through the water. They are outgrowths of the root. There's debate whether or not they're actually present to facilitate that gaseous exchange. We tend to suggest that that is in fact the case, because it is well known that oxygen is an important part of the root system. It also bears noting that those knees can add to that kind of lateral support, kind of further buttressing the leaf base. What else have we got? The bird species, how far do they fly? We have all kinds of migrant bird species that pass through our preserves, both here in the uplands and freshwater wetlands and down at the coast. The plants are adapted to their arrival. They take advantage of those birds coming through. The list of migrant birds is almost endless, most of our little songbirds, and they're beginning to come through now. Asking about guided hikes, yes. For now, these are going to be our guided hikes. We're going to do the hiking for you and invite you to join us along, unfortunately, virtually. If you would like to explore cypress domes on your own, we would suggest visiting the Brooker Creek Headwaters Preserve, which is about 9 miles east of Brooker Creek Preserve. The Brooker Creek Headwaters is a series of pastures, meadows, forests, and domes. And you can actually see some of these wonderful small islands of cypress plants. You can go into those domes. You're quite free to walk around. Unfortunately, most of the trails here at Brooker Creek don't pass through the actual cypress domes themselves. You can get very, very close, and you can certainly get a feel for what the domes look like on the inside, but our actual trails don't quite pass through. So good questions, and let's just carry on. Wait a minute, was that the same one we just saw? Yes, we're gonna carry on to this next. See if you can spot.
Do you see it? Can you find the mantis? Can you find the grizzled mantis being perfectly camouflaged on the lichen on the trunk of this holly tree? Let me give it a little bit of a scare, not too much. Get it to move. There's our mantis. Oh, he gave me the business. That's the grizzled mantis, camouflaged hunter, lying in wait for potential prey.
We did not put that there. Everything here, this was done in one morning, almost one take. So these are just plants and animals that we came across in this particular little cypress dome right here on the preserve.
A young cypress just breaking through the water, hoping to get its head through the canopy and up into the sunshine. This is a young pond cypress. Now, the young needles, the young leaves are flared out. They're held kind of flat. They're taking advantage of as much sunlight as they can down here in the shade. So light is kind of a limiting factor. Once this individual or a member of its species, the pond cypress, once they poke through the canopy and get their head all the way up into the sun, their needles change habit and they point upwards, giving this species its species name, Taxodium ascendens. So the needles are ascending, they're pointing upwards. And ironically, this is kind of a protection against too much sun. They've kind of pointed up towards the sun, so they're not getting that full bore sunlight on them, and they can just receive enough to photosynthesize efficiently for this species. Now, when they're young, like this, with their shade leaves, they could be mistaken for the other species, the bald cypress, Taxodium disticum, that retains these flared out needles throughout their life. So that's how you would tell the two species of cypress apart, if you ascribe to the two-species theory. Some scientists believe that it's simply the same species with two different needle types. So take your pick. A young. Back on the edge of the Cypress Dome, here's a smaller plant. Remember, this ground is probably going to dry up in the dry season, and so this individual isn't going to have the access to as much water as the larger plants towards the center. But it has all the characteristics of a plant that's adapted to life in standing water. It's got the buttressing, but cypress also have a very spongy bark. Fire is still a very real reality for life in this part of Florida, even in cypress domes. So the fire, of course, would come to the edge of the cypress dome, but if it were to jump in, the cypress have a way of putting that fire out. They're very spongy. So even in the absence of the standing water, if fire were to get into the dome, these can slowly burn and hopefully smother out. It's not completely foolproof. A fire did come through here maybe 7 years ago, and unfortunately it completely overwhelmed the bark on this individual. And so you can see where the bark was burnt through. We now have only the heartwood, which does not conduct any water or nutrient. So effectively, this individual was cut off from all of its water and nutrition, and it eventually just starved to death. But it's still standing, and just like the holly that we met before, you can see the little holes. It's filling up with wood-boring insects and grubs, all sorts of things, all kind of decay organisms, the fungus and the bacteria, all these sorts of things. So still definitely providing its ecological services even as a dead cypress. So we talked about a wetland as having to meet 3 criteria to be classified as a wetland: a particular type of soil, a particular collection of animal species, and a certain collection of plant species as well. Now, we've ticked off a lot of the plant species that are maybe dependent or certainly adapted to life in the Cypress Dome, but where are the animals? What do you think the base of the food chain would be here in a wetland area? The microorganisms that live in the water. Step up from that, perhaps the small fish. And we do have certainly a large population of small mosquito fish or gambusia. But above that, we don't have much diversity at all. We have frogs that use this area for living, spawning. We have the insects that come and take advantage of the living and the dead plants. We have the insects that can fly in. We have the mosquitoes, of course, that are using the standing water to reproduce, and the dragonflies, of course, that follow in and are the main predators of a lot of the flying insects. But the larger fish aren't found in here. That's because this is such a seasonal situation. Even if this dome holds water throughout the year, it doesn't hold enough to support larger fish. So unless there's a particularly long and extreme flood, the larger fish probably won't be found in these smaller domes, and we're just left with the smaller ones. Probably a good thing, since we're stomping around in water that we can't see through.
So that kind of gets to the whole where are the alligators theory there. It might be a nice place for an alligator to visit, but it certainly isn't a place where an alligator would stay for very long, at least not a large alligator, because it's missing the larger prey species that those larger predators would depend upon. In 2 weeks' time, we will be examining one of the small ponds here in Brooker Creek, and that's where we have deeper water, more permanent water, more access to more extensive food web, and therefore larger fish, and therefore the larger predators as well. Next week, we'll be investigating one of the channels that cuts through Brooker Creek Preserve. The preserve, we've mentioned before, originates in the Brooker Creek Headwaters, the place where I mentioned where you might be able to visit a Cypress Dome or two on your own. It's a rain-fed system that slowly flows southwest through Hillsborough County and across Pinellas County up here in the north, eventually ending up in Lake Tarpon. We have, as humans, built channels to conduct the water flow in a very controlled way, even through this watershed, even through this natural watershed, because we're, of course, surrounded by development. And we have to keep the floodwaters away from the development, so channels channel the water where humans want it to go. And what we'll look at next week is just how our native plants and animals have colonized or recolonized these channels and have recreated stream systems where we have moving water either throughout the year or slowly during times of drought. So we'll be excited to look at one or more of these channel systems.
So we talked about a wetland as having to meet three.
Wetland. So that's just going to finish up for today. We're about 10 minutes short. I'll have a look at some of the questions, but we will certainly be sending out a link once this presentation has been processed, recorded, and hopefully subtitled. Let us know what you think, either in the comments. Let me take a look at the chats. Yes, snakes would have definitely been present in, and they probably were present in the little dome that we were snooping around. Some of the water snakes, the Florida water snakes in particular, the dusky pygmy rattlesnakes, they tend to like to live on the edge of those wetlands. They would be hunting on the frogs that would be living around the edge. So yeah, there's definitely scope for a very detailed or complex food web, even within that tiny little dome. Thanks for coming, and really appreciate y'all's attention today. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. If you have any other questions, comments, complaints, that sort of thing, you can see my email address right here below my face. Drop me a line. Otherwise, we hope to see you back next week. And thanks again for joining us for today's Florida Super Nature.